When you think about the Protestant Reformation, what comes to mind? Probably a lot about faith, right? Kings, queens, big religious debates. But what if I told you there's another side to that story? A much darker side. One that's less about God and more about, well, money, power, and a massive heist. We're going to dive into a pretty radical retelling of this whole period, and it comes from a source you would probably never expect.
So get this. The writer William Cobbett calls it the rising of the rich against the poor. I mean, wow. That's not what they teach you in history class, is it? He's not talking about a theological dispute here. He's calling it a straight-up class war. In a statement that bold, it just completely flips the script. It makes you stop and ask, yeah, who would actually describe the Protestant Reformation that way? I mean, who has the nerve to look at this massive moment in history, one we usually see as this great enlightenment, and call it an act of total devastation against ordinary people?
Well, to really get where this outrageous claim is coming from, you've got to understand the man behind it. And let me tell you, William Cobbett was not your typical historian.
Okay, so this guy, Cobbett, he was a complete outsider. We're talking born to poor parents, a farm boy, then a private soldier. And get this, he taught himself grammar while earning just 6 pence a day. He literally used his knapsack as a bookcase. It's an incredible story. And through all that, he gained what he called his most valuable possession, a thorough knowledge of the English language. So you see, he wasn't some stuffy academic writing from an ivory tower. He knew what life was like for the lower classes because he was one of them. That firsthand experience is what gives his analysis so much weight. He's writing from the ground up. And man, his perspective is absolutely brutal. He basically calls the whole Reformation a sham, a lie cooked up as an excuse for a violent cash grab. For Cobbett, this story doesn't start with some big crisis of faith. No, it starts with the king's, let's call it a crisis of desire. Which brings us to the first big myth Cobbett just wants to tear down. The whole idea that the English Reformation happened because King Henry VIII was having this noble, or at least understandable, personal and religious crisis. Yeah, see, the timing is just everything. At first, Henry VIII was a huge opponent of Protestantism. He even wrote a book against it. But then what happens? The Pope won't give him a divorce from his wife of over 20 years. And suddenly, his deeply held religious beliefs get real flexible real fast. Cobbett's point is that this was never about piety. It was about power, pure and simple. And if you dared to stand in the king's way, you were going to pay a truly terrible price. And Cobbett, he doesn't just give you dry facts. He paints this gut-wrenching picture of the human cost. He talks about Bishop Fisher, a man the king used to call his father, being dragged to the scaffold after rotting in a filthy prison for 15 months, barely even clothed. This wasn't some polite disagreement or a theological debate. This was enforcement by sheer terror. But this kind of insane tyranny was met with some absolutely incredible defiance. Take the Countess of Salisbury. She was 70 years old, condemned without any trial. When they told her to put her head on the block, she basically said, "Nope, my head doesn't bow to tyrants. If you want it, you'll have to come and get it." The accounts Cobbett uses say the executioner literally had to chase her around the scaffold, hacking at her until she finally fell. I mean, that's the brutal reality of this new church, according to Cobbett. Okay, so after all that, to justify the next big step, which was a massive property grab, the new guys in charge needed a villain. And they found a perfect one: the monasteries. The plan was to paint them as totally corrupt and useless. You've probably heard the stereotypes, right? Monkish ignorance, superstition, the idea that monasteries were just filled with lazy monks, these drones who didn't contribute anything. Well, Cobbett says that's a load of nonsense. He calls it what it was: pure propaganda, cooked up to justify what he thinks was the single greatest act of theft in English history. And here's what makes Cobbett's argument so smart. He doesn't just rant. He uses Protestant sources, like a guy named Bishop Tanner, to totally tear this myth apart. He shows that, far from being lazy places, the monasteries were the entire social infrastructure of England. Think about it. They were the schools, the libraries, the hospitals, the homeless shelters. They even protected the weak from bullying local lords. They were the social safety net. And you know what? Cobbett argues that destroying that safety net, that was the whole point. That's what opened the door for the rising of the rich. Just look at this number, 2 million. And that's a conservative estimate of the acres of land seized from the church and local guilds. We're talking about one of the biggest transfers of wealth in the history of England.
It was taken from institutions that were built to serve the poor and handed on a silver platter directly to the king's friends. So here's how it went down, step by devastating step. First, Parliament dissolves hundreds of monasteries. Then, all their land gets handed over to the king's buddies, creating this whole new class of landlords. But here's the kicker. These new guys, unlike the monks, felt zero obligation to be charitable. So what did they do? They immediately jacked up the rents, fenced off common lands the poor depended on, and kicked people out. And just like that, for the first time in something like 900 years, England suddenly has a permanent class of paupers, desperate, landless people. And this wasn't some abstract economic thing you'd read in a textbook. Cobbett uses this really powerful image to show how it felt in real life. He says England went from being a land of roast beef to, all of a sudden, a land of dry bread or of oatmeal porridge. A country that was famous for how well-fed its people were was basically plunged into poverty overnight. And for Cobbett, if you want one symbol for the sheer barbarism of this whole thing, this is it. They demolished the tomb of Alfred the Great. I mean, this is the guy who basically founded English law, learning, liberty, the whole shebang. And they tore down his tomb, sold the lead from his coffin for scrap metal, and just scattered his ashes. To Cobbett, that was like declaring war not just on the poor, but on the very soul of England itself. So where did all this lead? What's the lasting legacy of what Cobbett calls a devastation? Well, according to him, it's a pretty unsettling reality. He says it basically re-engineered English society, and not for the better. This table really lays out Cobbett's whole argument, side by side. On one hand, you've got Catholic England. For 900 years, no official poor laws because there wasn't a permanent class of paupers. The church acted as a guardian. No national debt. Then, after the Reformation, you get Protestant England. The new doctrine of faith alone meant that good works, like charity, weren't theologically necessary anymore. So poof, there goes the foundation for social welfare. What do you get instead? The very first poor laws to manage all the beggars, and, believe it or not, the invention of the national debt to pay for wars. It's a shocking contrast. And for Cobbett, listen, these aren't just little historical footnotes. He's saying the consequences are still baked into our world today. He argues the Reformation wasn't really a great new beginning. It was an end. The end of an England where the poor had a kind of birthright to be taken care of. And it was the beginning of the massive social and economic divides that would shape the next 5 centuries. It was the moment, he says, that the rich rose up against the poor, and they won. So in the end, Cobbett's history isn't really an attack on Protestantism or Catholicism as faiths. It's a really brutal look at how noble-sounding ideas can be used as a smokescreen for plain old greed and a power grab. It challenges us to look under the hood of these big historical moments and ask a very simple and maybe a very unsettling question. Who really benefited?